Hi, I'm Nancy.
I'm Dave. I'm glad that you can be here today. We have our discussion continuing on through the book of Joel. We finished reading chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verse 17. Today we pick up in chapter 2, verse 18, looking at the Lord's words of compassion for the people.
All right, and I will begin reading in Joel chapter 2, verse 18. Then the Lord became passionate about this land and had pity on his people. The Lord responded to the people, "See, I am sending you the corn, new wine, and fresh oil, and you will be fully satisfied by it. And I will no longer make you a disgrace among the nations. I will remove the northern army from you and drive it into a dried up and desolate land, its front into the eastern sea and its rear into the western sea. Its stench will rise up, its stink will come to the surface. The Lord is about to do great things. Don't fear, fertile land, rejoice and be glad, for the Lord is about to do great things. Don't be afraid, animals of the field, for the meadows of the wilderness will turn green. The tree will bear its fruit, the fig tree and the grapevine will give their full yield. Children of Zion, rejoice and be glad in the Lord your God, because he will give you the early rain as a sign of righteousness. He will pour down abundant rain for you, the early and the late rain as before. The threshing floors will be full of grain, the vats will overflow with new wine and fresh oil. I will repay you for the years of the cutting locusts, the swarming locusts, the hopping locusts, and the devouring locusts have eaten. My great army which I sent against you. You will eat abundantly and be satisfied, and you will praise the name of the Lord your God, who has done wonders for you, and my people will never again be put to shame. You will know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am the Lord your God. No other exists. Never again will my people be put to shame, and that I will pour out. After that, I will pour out my spirit upon everyone. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions. In those days, I will also pour out my spirit on the male and female slaves.
I will give signs in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. But everyone who calls on the Lord's name will be saved. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be security, as the Lord has promised. And in Jerusalem the Lord will summon those who survive. Truly, in those days and in that time, I will bring back to Judah and Jerusalem those who were sent away.
I just feel like we
So
should end that with the word of the Lord.
I felt exactly that.
Oh, it just flows naturally after you're done reading.
It does. It does. So
All right.
Nancy, when we hear that, what stands out to you? What kind of sparks your imagination? Um, Maybe connection to the previous readings or from this reading itself?
Well, so remembering from the first part, right, all these locusts had come and eaten everything. There was nothing left. And it's the prophets equating that to all these locusts, something natural, um, to the Lord's army, right? He says, God even says that my great army, which I sent against you. Um, and so it's just, right, that really struck me this reading through, especially that all of creation truly is God's, right? And God can choose to use whatever he chooses to get his message across and to make his point. And that these people had lost everything, and yet God is saying, but there's hope. There's hope in me. So, what does it bring to your mind?
Yeah, I to build off of your point, that idea of the locust, I think is a very powerful one because the we need to remember in this time, there wasn't sort of the, social safety network, or, the bank system couldn't then suddenly say, I know what we'll do. We'll, give out extra stimulus checks to people, or things like that. The food of the field really was the entirety of the economy. This really was it. And if your food was eaten by locusts, you starved. There
Yeah.
wasn't plan B. Um, so this idea of God sending in his army really is a hard thought, because here it is, it's God's people he's sending his army against. God is bringing his judgment against his own people. God is using the locust to do it, and he's going to cause them to starve. And that is got to be a horrific fear of the people, to live in fear of God's judgment. And the way it goes over the locust, the cutting locust, the swarming locust, the hopping locust, the devouring locust, it really is like trying to cover all of the bases in the statement here, saying all of your crops will be devoured. Like, it will be completely gone. It's not like a portion here, it's everything.
Yeah.
And to me, that just stands out as a like, it's got to fill the people with dread of what might happen.
Yeah, yeah. And that was, I think that, right, that's an important point, that it is God's judgment on God's own people, and yet it's not a random thing, right? God had warned them, right? Pay attention, this could happen if you don't turn back towards me. So even though these were God's people, they had turned away from God, and perhaps, right, put all their hope in their crops instead of in God himself. And it, God passed his judgment on them, interrupted everything they thought they knew, um, to bring them to the point where they had no choice but to turn back to God, right? And I think that's an important point to remember when we read these harsh Old Testament stories of God's judgment, is it wasn't uncalled for, right? God didn't just wake up one day and decide to hit the smite button against the Israelites. It was they had done the very things he had told them not to.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they had fair warning, and they had prophets and judges and everybody else coming to them saying, you better straighten up. And they chose not to. So, and just to remember, it sounds a little less harsh that way when we remember that they were warned against it.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't a one-time warning. This is God saying, I will do this if you walk away from me. And understanding that calamity, God bringing judgment, is a way that he captures eyes to draw them back to him, to say, hey, look, folks, open up your eyes, look at the way, self-reflect, look at the way you're living life. And is that following in my footsteps or not? It is, if you will, a broad paintbrush, broad strokes of the judgment of God. This isn't God smiting individuals, but God's national judgment, God's national or action against nations or against people groups. But he is acting here. And in contrast to just the judgment, like these verses, though, I think very strongly highlight the ones we read today about the post-judgment action of God. Yeah. That God's intention isn't in this case to destroy Israel, but to discipline Israel from their and Judah from their actions. So the words are in verse 18, the Lord became passionate about this land and had pity on his people. So this is post-judgment world. What is God now going to do?
Yeah, and things are going to be even better than they were before. So the corn and new wine and fresh oil, and they'll be satisfied. And right, and it says, "I will no longer make you a disgrace among the nations." Right? I mean, we see that in the modern world today. People see see those of us who claim to follow Jesus not acting very Jesus-like, and right, then there is shame and disgrace in that. And so when we
Hmm.
truly follow Jesus in all that we say and do, um, there is no reason for anyone to shame or disgrace us. We are not disgracing ourselves. We're actually truly following what it is we say we believe.
Hmm.
And so,
Hmm.
that's not a new phenomenon, apparently. Apparently, they were doing it too, thousands of years ago.
Yeah. And this idea of, the people's God calling the people back to him, and the people apparently turning, and God
Mhm.
then offering these blessings, restoring them. It doesn't mean that the pain that the people went through didn't exist, but the pain and the discipline that they went through is supposed to stand as a stark reminder of what happens when you try and walk against what God is calling you to. It's supposed to stand as a, I don't know what you want to call it, a pillar in your life, a remembrance stone, as what
Mhm.
happens when you do attempt to walk away from God, when you do forget about what he's done and who he is and
Mhm.
how he's made this world to operate. Like, that's what it sort of seems to come back to. And so here we see the God now pouring out these blessings. So in a agricultural economy, well, the locus is, if you will, the consequence. The blessing, as you pointed to, is the wine, is the overabundance of now this food. And God is saying, look, I will bless you economically, with provision, with blessing, with abundance, in contrast with what has gone before. It doesn't mean the judgment didn't happen, but it's now beyond that judgment. It's now blessing. And
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but this reminds me of the Old Testament story of Job, right? Where Job's family basically fell apart with all of these problems, these judgments, these uh, tests, and then hear
Mhm.
from this moment, or from the end, we then hear of, at the end of the story, God blessing Job above and beyond what he had in the first place. Does
Yeah.
that mean that Job suddenly forgot about all the difficult times that he experienced? No, certainly
Mhm.
not. But it does say that then God blessed him abundantly more than he had before.
Right. Yeah. And that's, he tells them, right, the Lord is about to do great things. Don't fear. And then he turns and he talks, right, to creation. He says, don't fear, fertile land, rejoice and be glad, right? So he even tells the fields, um, you too are part of my redemption, right? I'm going to redeem the people and all of creation, the
Mm.
land, and the trees and the animals of the field, right? So it's all a part of it, right? When God redeems, when God makes new and restores, it's not just humans that benefit. It is all of creation, and so the land will be even more fertile, and so um, the animals will be even more abundant because there will be lots of green grass and fruit for them as well as the people. And so
Yeah.
it's God restores everything, not just not just us humans, but he wants to redeem all of creation because all of creation got corrupted with the fall.
Yeah, and there's certainly a connection there between, um, if you will, strata of authority or leadership. That the as humanity fails and sins, that which was under humanity's care or stewardship
Mhm.
then is hurt as well. And that
Yeah.
if God is to bring judgment upon humanity, or even a section of humanity, that which is under its care will also feel the burden, the pain of that discipline.
Hmm.
Just sort of thinking, like, if you were an employer and you have to discipline or fire or financially punish somebody who works for you, well, their kids are going to feel your action.
Hmm.
And so similarly, if God is bringing judgment upon this group of people, well, that which is under their stewardship. The land here is going to feel that punishment, that consequence.
Yeah. And, you know, it's like back when we were all in kindergarten and 2 kids misbehaved and we all had to stay in from recess, right? The whole class. It's a lesson in thinking beyond ourself and our individuality, right? We are part of it. Because I am sure there were very righteous people in still left in Israel. And they suffered the consequences of everyone, because we are God's people. We are all connected, and what we do impacts each other, and all of creation. And if we haven't learned that lesson through COVID, I don't know what can teach us that lesson. But it took everyone staying home and wearing masks, and it's going to take everybody getting vaccinated to get this thing under control. So we are bigger than ourselves.
It stands sort of as a contrast, of course, to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where we talk about even the righteous felt the pain of this. When Abraham stands with God, and Abraham says, if there are but 10 righteous, will you not spare the city? And God says, yes, for 10 righteous I'll spare the city. Were there 10 righteous in the city? There were not. And so the angels go down.
He started with 50, didn't he?
Yeah.
If there were 50 righteous people.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I don't know, who knows the mind of God, but in that moment, like to anthropomorphize God in this moment, the parents staring at the child Abraham, being like, oh God, but for 50, for 10 righteous, would you not spare the city? And God being like, yeah, for 10 I wouldn't destroy the city. Nope. And guess what, Abraham? There are not 10. I know how many righteous are in there, and it is not 10. Even Lot's family I'm sparing, but they ain't doing so hot themselves. Right. So God goes down and takes Lot's family out from the mix. And I think that's a sort of a contrasting story to this narrative, because in that God drew out the righteous to protect them, if you can call Lot's family righteous. But here in this story, any even so-called righteous, God doesn't seem, or at least we're not given privy information to God sparing them any hardship. That they are, if you will, painted by the same brush as those God is bringing judgment upon. Granted, this is not nearly quite so harsh judgment as Sodom and Gomorrah, but certainly the hardship of food, of starvation, that would be felt by all. There wouldn't be any escape from that.
Right. Yeah. It was all over. And it's just interesting that you bring up Abraham and Lot, and we can't ignore Lot's wife, who turned back because she wanted one last look at what life was, even though God had already said that life is over. And she became a pillar of salt. She was turned to rock. And so that's such an incredible lesson for all of us, is we may long for what was before, but we know that what God has in front of us, because he promises it to us, is even better. And we keep moving forward.
And so in that sort of vein, in that same idea, what would you say, looking at our current cultural context, like what stands out for you, this story's relationship to where we're at? Not saying that, of course, this is an exact, connection. God wrote this in Joel 4 today, but I mean, looking at some of perhaps the eternal narratives of God's bringing judgment, bringing discipline on his people, and then post that bringing blessing. If we can look at some of those relationships of the way God relates to his people, what would you perhaps say is something that we might be able to draw from that for today?
Well, I think in the current pandemic situation, right, we were given this time of interruption, of everything that we had, everything we thought we knew, just like they did, right? Their crops were everything to them. And life as we knew it got stopped suddenly and abruptly and unexpectedly. Um, and I hear people talking about, oh, I can't wait to get back to normal. And, I think, do we really want everything that we had before, everything going the way it was, where we were busy for busy's sake, right? We were involved in way more than really physically we were able to keep up with. I mean, we'd put our kids in 20 different activities, and we ourselves were enrolled in 6 or 8 different things and are participating in. And, it just seemed everyone was worn out and exhausted all the time. And so now, as we go back out into the world, as we begin that transition, um, I think we need to be selective about our time and what we value, and really let the things we choose to do reflect our internal core values of who we think we are and who we believe God is calling us to be. And I think that's a huge lesson of this time that we can take. The folks had the choice. Joel was telling them, God said things are going to get better, so you can turn to God and look for the good, or you can just get lost in what was. And so I think that's our lesson. What do you see?
I would agree. Now, I wouldn't want to conflate the narrative of judgment with every bad thing that happens in our world, right? To suddenly be like, that's God's judgment, that's God's judgment. But I like how you phrased that at the very beginning, that there's an opportunity here for because of the interruption that this has been to our normal, for self-evaluation, for recognition. And I think that whenever there is something that we could construe as judgment, to take a moment of pause and to look at it and say, okay, folks, this might be God's judgment, but I don't see a prophet standing up to say it is, at least certainly not one that I trust is a prophet of God. But what we can say always, and we can use every opportunity to say, to use this as a mirror, to say, God is the entirety of my life reflecting you. And I'm pretty sure that 90% of the time I can say no. So I can use these to say, God, where am I falling short personally? Where is my ministry, my attempt at my pursuit of you? Where is that falling short? And in that, I can say, yeah, how can I take stock of my life and make changes? And I think very much, Nancy, I think you're bang on. Do I want to go back to pre-pandemic norm? No, I do not. I want to move beyond the norm of that to something that is more righteous, that is more focused on God, and say, look at what was. It's kind of like cleaning house, right? And if you do have the luxury of time to take everything out of every nook and cranny of your house and lump it all into one place, and then to be able to pick through it, pick each item up and go, do I need you? Nope.
Yeah.
Gone. Right. And to be able to do that, but not with stuff, obviously, but with our lives, the way we were doing things before, and say, do I want to keep this? Does this build the kingdom of God? Does this build me as a citizen of God's kingdom, as a child of God, as an apostle, a disciple, as a minister of God's kingdom? If not, gone. And to have this opportunity is amazing. But yeah, I don't want to fall back into pre-pandemic quote unquote norm, just because I feel like this was too much of a gift to be able to do that.
Right. Yeah. To get disrupted this way. I always just say
Hmm.
to people who say when things get back to normal, my joke is normal's just a setting on the washing machine. Just don't even use that. But I like the way you say norm, which is very different from normal, right? A norm is something that shapes and guides our life. And I do agree with you very much about we can't label everything bad in our life as God's judgment. One, that's just not how God works. And two, it's kind of a cop out, right? It takes away our personal accountability, right? Stuff happens, and it's because some generally something I've done to cause it to happen, and to stop and self reflect and go, okay, how can I take this situation and make it a learning experience so that I can move forward and grow and be more like Jesus every day in God's
Hmm.
kingdom.
Hmm. There's, I was reading my own personal devotionals yesterday and came across Psalm 20, and I was just sort of moved by its power. And, it's just this, uh, it talks about blessing upon blessing. And, one of the verses that says, let God grant what is in your heart and fulfill your plans. Then we will rejoice that you've been helped. We will fly our flags in the name of God. Let the Lord fulfill all your requests. And it's just this sense or this idea of the people having their heart turned towards, or the individual having his heart turned towards God and receiving that blessing. And I think that that really is for us in any situation of life, but truly in this moment where we have this time to reflect, this time to evaluate our lives, to really be able to say, I want my life to truly reflect and be about God Himself, and to
Mhm.
know God. And yeah, I think there's this incredible opportunity we have. And so I pray that truly, like, that we would receive those blessings, absolutely, but to even more so than just receiving, quote unquote, the blessings, receive the blessing of the relationship with God Himself. And I think that's what it where of course the blessings stem from or come from, because as we look at the book of Revelation, for us New Testament people, we have the image in the book of Revelation that all blessings come and flow from the throne itself. Life flows from God. And so as we do turn our hearts to being kingdom people, God people, then those blessings flow out into our lives onto us. Um, so yeah, I don't I don't know what more to say than I think that the as the people do, as us, as we, the people of God, turn our hearts, in verse 12, what we read last week, uh, you know, even now, says the Lord, return to me with all your hearts, tear your hearts and not your clothing. This sense of, um, Jeremiah phrases it as, the circumcision of the heart. This idea
Mhm.
of the callousness of the people, and as you're able to tear away that callousness, to then expose the vulnerability and to be vulnerable before God Himself, then we are able to have that vulnerability of relationship and then to truly receive from God. And I think that's something that we need to walk in today, especially.
I agree very much. Well said. Well said.
Is there anything else that stands out to you as we read this? I feel like we've kind of, like, from my perspective, we've
Yeah.
gone through it quite well, but um, I don't want to miss any sort of gems that you might have.
No, I think we're good. I have said stuff that was in my mind and on my heart to say about it, and I look forward to our final session on Joel next week. But this has been good.
Okay,
Been good.
excellent. Well, will pick up and do a recap next week and finish off with chapter 3.
All right, sounds good.
All right.